Hello, everybody. Good to see you all this afternoon. My name is Dr. Callie Tabor with the Department of Catholic Studies here at SHU. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this event in the Center for Catholic Studies Lecture Series and the Human Journey Colloquia Series. This series brings the Catholic intellectual tradition into conversation with important questions of thought, culture, and society. And today we have a lecture that will invite us to consider insights from the life of Venerable Mother Mary Lange, who founded the Oblate Sisters of Providence, the first order of African American nuns in the United States. Alongside figures like Sister Thea Bowman and Pierre Toussaint, whose names you may recognize from the halls named after them here on campus, Mother Mary Lange is one of several Black Catholics from the U.S. from the 19th and 20th centuries who are now in the process of being officially canonized saints in the Catholic Church. You can learn more about the lives of so many Black Catholic women who struggled against the forces of white supremacy and patriarchy in lives of activism and prayer in this fantastic book, Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle, which was written by today's speaker, Dr. Shannon D. Williams. Dr. Williams is Associate Professor of History at the University of Dayton in Ohio. She is an award-winning scholar of the African American experience and Black Catholicism, with research and teaching specializations in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. Dr. Williams holds a BA in history with magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa honors from Agnes Scott College, an MA in Afro-American Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a PhD in history from Rutgers University. The first Black woman elected to the Executive Council of the American Catholic Historical Association, Dr. Williams is a co-founder of the Fleming Morrow Endowment in African American History at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. In 2020, Dr. Williams also submitted successful proposals to establish the Mother Mary Lange Lecture in Black Catholic History at Villanova University and the Cyprian Davis OSB Prize through the American Catholic Historical Association and the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams to speak on why Venerable Mother Mary Lange matters.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. It is such a pleasure to come to Sacred Heart University in celebration of Black History Month, but also at the invitation of the Center and Department for Catholic Studies here. I can think of no better way to celebrate Black History Month other than celebrating Mother Lange or Lange. You can pronounce it as both. In part because her Oblate Sisters of Providence are the first representatives of the Catholic Church to teach, celebrate, and promote Black history within church boundaries. Indeed, any survey of their archives, their newspapers, student papers, publications will see very illustrious celebrations of Negro History Week, which was the predecessor to Black History Month, and again gives us a true understanding of what they embodied and what I like to say Black history is and always has been Catholic history. I come to you today in celebration of Black History Month and in celebration of the nation's historically African-American Catholic sisterhoods, and especially the story of Mother Lange's Oblate Sisters of Providence, in part because their story reminds us not only of the African foundations of American Catholicism, it reminds us also that there have always been two transnational stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and another one that begins with African-descended people who were living in Europe, and also those who come as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. These individual stories remind us that Black history is and always has been Catholic history within the United States, but also within the wider Atlantic world. Yet myself and my own journey suggests that some of this history has not always been widely accessible to those of us who are of the faith. Indeed, my own book began as an attempt to make sense of what I consider to be a rather extraordinary news story that I came across while I was in graduate school at Rutgers. I was scanning through a microfilmed edition of the Pittsburgh Courier and came across a newspaper article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic Nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. More than that article's title, Black Sisters Weigh Contradiction in Christian and Secular Community, 200 Negro Nuns Attend First National Meet, it was the accompanying photograph of these four smiling Black Catholic sisters that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader to that day. Until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only Black sister that I knew at the time was Sister Mary Clarence, who was the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed Sister Act film franchise. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 African-American women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah when I was growing up. So indeed, stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and to understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. And indeed, what I began to realize is that when I studied Black sisters, I also recognized that they themselves were many times the first keepers and takers of Black Catholic history and recorders of Black Catholic history. In 1975, a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference, Sister Mary Shawn Copeland, who was Detroit's first Black Felician sister and later an Adrian Dominican nun, had attempted in an article for the National Catholic Reporter to write the first full history of Black sisters in the United States. That article, entitled Black Nuns, An Uneasy Story, began, quote, "The saga of America's Black women who've dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic." In many ways, my book, Subversive Habits, is an attempt to complete the work that was launched by the National Black Sisters Conference. To write the first full history of Black Catholic sisters in the United States is to undertake an endeavor that reminds us that to narrate the history of the American Catholic experience from the perspective of Black women and girls gives us great insights in what it has meant to be an American Catholic in this nation, but also within the wider Americas. And indeed, in telling the story of Venerable Mother Mary Lange and her Oblate Sisters of Providence, who are not only our nation's first Roman Catholic sisterhood, freely open to African-descended women and girls, but also the modern world's first Roman Catholic sisterhood, freely open to Black women and girls, reminds us again, not only of those African foundations of American Catholicism, but also forces us to grapple with the reality that the American Catholic experience has always been one that has been racially and ethnically diverse. Remarkable about the story of the American Catholic experience is that the United States will give the modern world 8 historically Black Roman Catholic sisterhoods. All were founded in the cradles of American Catholicism, which cannot be found in the urban North or Midwest, but instead are found in the South, in places like Florida, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Louisiana. Of those 8, all were teaching sisterhoods, or were slated to be teaching sisterhoods except one. And in the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded in Baltimore in 1828, they are also the first Roman Catholic sisterhood in the United States to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are the 4th oldest Roman Catholic sisterhood established in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, which is our nation's oldest Black sisterhood, founded by Venerable Mother Mary Lange. She herself was born in the late 18th century, we believe in Cuba, to African-descended parents who were originally from Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti. We know from the historical record that she and her mother fled during the times of the slave rebellion that transformed into the Haitian Revolution and fled into the port cities of the United States, eventually settling in Baltimore, where Mary Lange and 2 of her friends began running a school out of her home in order to be able to educate the free and enslaved Black refugee children also fleeing from the Haitian Revolution. We know that for more than 10 years, she and her friends had also felt a desire to go into religious life, but had no opportunity to actually pursue their religious vocations. However, they will receive the attention of a French priest who had also come into the United States, into Baltimore, fleeing the Haitian Revolution. Father James Jobert serves as the inaugural spiritual advisor and founder to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And in his journal, he documents the great resistance that the pioneering Black sisters faced in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Again, he writes, quote, "For more than 10 years, they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him." Now, in this particular diary entry, he does not say which communities rejected them in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, but because only 3 communities precede them in that diocese, we have a clear sense of who it was. It would have either been the Carmelites who were in Baltimore, the Visitation Sisters who were in the Georgetown community of Washington, D.C., and St. Elizabeth Seton's Daughters of Charity, who are founded in nearby Emmitsburg just a decade earlier. We also know from the records, particularly from Father James Joubert's diary, that the sisters faced profound resistance from the wider Catholic community in Baltimore, who do not believe that Black women should be allowed to go into religious life. And they also faced resistance from the clerical community. He wrote, quote, "I knew already that many persons who had approved of the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community." We also know that at least one priest in the Archdiocese of Baltimore at the time decried the organization of the Oblate Sisters of Providence as a, quote, "profanation of the habit." Despite that opposition, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, under the protection of Father James Joubert and the Archbishop of Baltimore, will survive and thrive through the 19th and 20th centuries. And we know that many of the earliest Black Catholic women who joined the Oblate Sisters of Providence can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church and the free and enslaved African American and European Catholics who helped to found the early American church. We know that one of their earliest members is a young woman named Anne Marie Beecraft. Anne Marie Beecraft's name has come back to us in recent years as a part of Georgetown University's ongoing efforts to make reparation for their slaveholding past. A few years ago, students submitted a proposal to rename one of the halls on Georgetown's campus after Anne Marie Beecraft, after discovering a biography about her life, noting that she had founded one of the earliest Catholic schools in Washington, D.C., and the oldest Black Catholic high school and academy in the nation. What's also significant about Anne Marie Beecraft is that we know from the historical record that her father, William Beecraft, was the, quote, "natural son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton," unquote. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is a member of the founding families of the Maryland colony. He is cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who is the nation's first Catholic bishop, and he is also the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. In other words, Anne Marie Beecraft is the only Catholic sister that we know who has a literal birthright and blood right to the early nation through the Carroll family. We also know from the early historical record that she appears in the first national report ever written on education in the nation. She is described as the, quote, "most remarkable colored young woman of her time in the district and perhaps of any time." She is noted for her piety, her intellect, her beauty, but also it is a reminder that indeed she evidences a revolutionary commitment to Black education and a vocation to religious life long before the formation of the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore. Also, again, the Oblate Sisters of Providence and their early members will not only sort of refuse to employ a class or color barrier, but they also reject that, again, racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. We know that prior to the federal abolition of slavery in 1865, the community will admit at least 8 women who were born into slavery into their ranks. One of these members is Ellen Joseph West. We do actually know a lot about her because at the time, in the turn of the 20th century, she is actually believed to be the oldest Catholic sister in the United States. And so many newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, actually do a series of stories on her. And like the other members of that community who were born into slavery, she herself, when she enters the community, will bring her manumission records. We also know that before the federal abolition of slavery, that the Oblate Sisters of Providence will take at least one woman who was still enslaved, but are able to secure her freedom before she's allowed to profess vows. And we know a bit more about her because they were also educating this enslaved woman in their St. Francis Academy, which remains the nation's oldest continuously serving Black Catholic school in Baltimore, Maryland. Other early Oblate Sisters of Providence are connected to many early pioneering figures in the African American freedom struggle. This is Mary Gertrude Smallwood, born Lydia Smallwood. Her father, Joseph Smallwood, was born, we believe, in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and eventually tried to make his fortune in California. He appears repeatedly in the historical record, in part because he is the only person from California to attend all of the colored conventions of the 19th century. She also comes from a family of educators. One brother was a personal secretary to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Salmon P. Chase. Another brother, James Smallwood, founds the first Black school in York, Pennsylvania, also goes on to have a distinguished career as a Mason, but again, reminding us specifically of the families, and specifically the Black Catholic families, who will produce and give the church many of its earliest pioneering Black priests and sisters. This is also true of the Wade family. The Wade family, in the case of their father, Benjamin, was enslaved by the Jesuits in St. Mary's County, Maryland. Their mother, Carolyn, was free, and her family was free by the time of the 1860 census. But this particular family will send many of their children and grandchildren into religious life. There's an older Wade sister, Mary Josepha Wade, who becomes an early Oblate Sister of Providence before the time of the end of the Civil War. And then the Wades themselves will send two of their daughters, Mary Angela and Mary Pius Wade, into the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And one of their sons, in fact, Francis, will become one of the first 4 African-American SVD priests. What's interesting, when you look at the names of the family members, many of them take the names of Roman Catholic saints. In the case, they actually have an uncle who is named Gonzaga Wade, who appears in the historical record. Other early Oblate Sisters of Providence can trace and can be linked to other early African-American sisterhoods in the United States. In this particular case, this is Sister Mary Ursula Wallace. She herself had actually been a member of the Sisters of the Holy Family, which is the second successful African-American sisterhood established in the United States, established in New Orleans, Louisiana. She herself will leave the Sisters of the Holy Family after the Civil War, after that community splits over a decision to admit its first formerly enslaved member, who was also darker skinned. Because she disagreed with the trajectory of that community, she decides to come into the Oblate Sisters of Providence after failing to establish her own community in Vicksburg, Mississippi. She herself will come into the Oblate Sisters of Providence at the turn of the 20th century, and then will be sent to Cuba, where she will minister for several years until her death in 1930. She herself, like many early African-American sisters, was multilingual. And this is true not only for the other African-American sisterhoods, but especially the Oblate Sisters of Providence. This community not only preserves the vocations of African-descended women who were educated by white sisters in the United States, but also those who were educated by European and white sisterhoods in Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean, but who were denied admission into the communities of their educators solely on the basis of race. And so with this community and many of their members, they are also multi-ethnic and multilingual. In the case of Mary Ursula Wallace, she speaks all of the languages of European colonization in terms of Spanish, French, and English in the United States. Many early Oblate Sisters of Providence also, in their stories, document the fact that many African-American women who feel called to religious life were forced to travel hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter communities willing to accept them. Here is Mary Louisa Glenn, who took the religious name Mary Ludwina Glenn. She herself was the first graduate of the historically Black Blessed and later St. Peter Claver School in San Antonio, Texas, established by servant of God Margaret Murphy Healy's Sisters of the Holy Ghost in San Antonio. Although she is biracial, that community will not accept her into their community. In fact, even though she could technically pass for a non-Black Latina, because that community would take non-Black Latinas, they still do not allow Mary Louisa Glenn to enter the community. So she is forced to leave San Antonio and enter the Oblate Sisters of Baltimore, where she remains until the end of her life in 1945. In certain instances, when we begin to look at the stories of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, we also are forced to confront the realities of racial passing in women's religious life. Indeed, many communities, European and white Americans, would take women of color as long as they were not of African descent. And so sometimes we have examples of African descended women being allowed or at least being granted permission to enter European and white American communities before the era of desegregation. In most of those instances, they are only allowed to go into those communities if they can simply pass for white or simply as non-Black, because most communities would take Native American women, they would take women of Asian descent, they would take non-Black Latina women. And so if you were racially ambiguous or simply could pass as non-Black, some communities would make exceptions for you on the condition that you agreed to never reveal your racial heritage to any of the people in the community, or if you were a teacher or a nurse, any people that you would serve or minister to as a member of that community. You also generally had to agree not to visit any more of your family members who were visibly Black, that you had to cut those ties. We certainly know that there are many women who do make that decision to do so, but the vast majority of women, at least to the historical record, who we know were given that option, refused to do so, and several of them enter into the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One of them is a young woman named Rebecca Clifford, who in 1905, after becoming the valedictorian of St. Francis de Sales Academy in Rockcastle, Virginia, rejects the offer to enter a white sisterhood in Philadelphia on the condition that she not only pass for white, but also cut ties with her visibly Black mother. Instead, she joins the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore and leads that community from 1926 until her death in 1937. And what's remarkable about this case of racial passing and her refusal to pass for white in this particular community is that we do have insights in terms of why she makes this decision. She is quoted in a letter from one of her high school teachers who she discussed this option with, and she stated, quote, clearly, that I should not have my mother visit me, I think positively wrong and not the will of God. My mother is making a great sacrifice in giving up her only daughter to God. She is doing it most willingly. Should I impose an unnecessary sacrifice upon her? My decision in this is that the white people have many to work for them, but the colored people have very few. They are my own people, and I think God wants me to give them the first place, and I don't think that I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise. It is a remarkable stand for this young woman, and she will continue this stand when she takes her community into the nadir of American race relations. She will be the superior who will oversee the Oblate Sisters of Providence when they become the first African-American students at many of the nation's earliest institutions, Catholic institutions of higher education. She will also oversee the growth of that community, which by the turn of the 20th century will be the largest Roman Catholic sisterhood for Black women in the United States and in much of the Atlantic world. Other early Oblate Sisters of Providence are traced and linked to very notable African-American families. This is actually Sister Mary Claude Hudlin, who enjoyed a career as a public school teacher before she became an Oblate Sister of Providence. Her family can trace their roots to Illinois. We know that her grandparents were conductors on the Underground Railroad in Illinois, Peter and Nancy Hudlin. You may know her nephew, Reginald Hudlin. He is actually a very famous African-American director. He directed House Party, a former president of BET Entertainment, and so on. Many African-American sisters, again, come from very notable and pioneering African-American families. This is Sister Venetia Falls, Mr. Mary of the Presentation Falls. Her brother, Dr. Arthur Falls, was the founding president of the Chicago Catholic Worker. Her parents also come from New Orleans, from Creole families. We also know that her mother was an early suffragist alongside of Ida B. Wells in Chicago, Illinois. She joins the Oblate Sister of Providence in the first half of the 20th century and remains until her death. In some instances, again, African-American women who make their way into the Oblate Sisters of Providence were, again, those who were educated by white sisters, but then rejected admission into the community of their educators. And among those that I interviewed and had the opportunity to interview was Sister Mary Alice Chenoweth, born Innocence Chenoweth. In 1934, she was denied admission into the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the BVM sisters, who were her high school educators, and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, founded by St. Catherine Drexel. She herself is born to a German-American mother and an African-American father, and is heartbroken when she learns that she cannot enter the community of her educators. They, however, do not make her aware of the existence of Black nuns when they instead encourage her to write to Catherine Drexel because her community ministered exclusively in the African American and Native American communities. And they told her, surely if anyone would accept you, Mother Catherine would accept you. Mother Catherine rejects her admissions request, noting that her community will not accept African American women, but does make her aware of the existence of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and she joins that community and remains until her death. What's significant about this particular story is that her mother, Victoria Schlicker Chenoweth, is so distraught about what happens to her daughter that after the death of her husband, she becomes a lay assistant to the BVM sisters in their African American schools. She knows that the sisters do not make those vocations that they are producing aware of the existence of Black orders. And so she herself goes and serves as a lay assistant to all of their Black schools. And anytime the sisters reject a Black young woman, her mother intervenes. So there were 3 African American women who were rejected admission into the BVMs in Memphis, Tennessee, whose vocations were saved because Victoria Chenoweth pulled the girls aside afterwards and made them aware of the existence of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And they credit her specifically with saving their vocation. One of the former superiors of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, Sister Charlotte Marshall, credits Victoria Chenoweth. And she said, at that time, we didn't know who she was. She just simply said, after I was heartbroken and crying one day after school, I know of a community that will accept you. My daughter is there. And Sister Charlotte said, well, I didn't realize she had married an African-American man. And so I thought I was going in just to another white community that was just far more progressive. But she learned, of course, that those were the Oblate Sisters of Providence. We have notable examples of African-American Catholics who, like their white American and European counterparts, will send many of their children into religious life. These are the famous Burke sisters, the children of Emma and Charles Burke of St. Augustine Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky. It is the oldest African-American Catholic church in Kentucky. Many of the founders of that church were the enslaved people who helped to build the Holy Land in Kentucky. Emma and Charles Burke are founding members of St. Augustine's, and they send 5 of their daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence after they are rejected admission into the communities of their educators in Louisville. One Burke sister gets sick during her time in the novitiate and she comes home, but the 4 remaining Burke sisters remain until their deaths, and the last Burke sister died just a few years ago. We also have the famous Price siblings of Baltimore, Maryland, who are the children of George and Lillian Price. They will send 4 of their daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence and 1 son into the Josephite community, which is a community of priests that minister exclusively in the African American community. Even pioneering Black sisters in white communities have direct links to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. What we know in the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, not only do they preserve the vocations of Black women and girls rejected admission into the communities of their white educators, but they also preserve the vocations of many pioneering Black sisters in white communities who are not welcomed in those communities. Oftentimes we know in their annals, in their general council minutes, that any time that the Oblate Sisters of Providence found out that a community was beginning to desegregate, the Oblates always sent members to bear witness at those profession ceremonies, to always reach out to those young women, just to let them know that they were in town. If they ever needed anything, that they could always come to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. In fact, these are the first 3 African-American Sisters of St. Mary, which is a community, a German nursing community in St. Louis, Missouri. They will very publicly break the color barrier in 1946 by accepting 5 African-American members, 3 in July, 2 in December. In the case of this community, though, when those sisters are admitted, they are not admitted on an equal basis. The community builds an entirely separate novitiate. They enforce segregation in the dining, in the socializing. The first 5 members cannot enter their mother house, and when they're finally allowed to enter the mother house, they have to enter through the back doors. Also, they are among a handful of pioneering Black sisters in white communities who are allowed, or who are forced, to profess their vows in segregated ceremonies. In the case of the Sisters of St. Mary, we actually have a photograph of their segregated profession here. Now, I actually had this photograph, which is contained in the archives of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., for years before I noticed the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Can you see them? They're seated. They are there. And what we know for the African American women who enter into this community, because the Oblate Sisters of Providence are stationed in St. Louis from the late 19th century, because after the church and after the federal abolition of slavery, the church abandons its formerly enslaved Catholic constituency, and so they have to bring in the Oblates to minister to that community. And the Oblates are there from the late 19th century to the end of the 20th century. They found the first Black Catholic high school in St. Louis, and many of their students enter into the nursing school that had been run by this community, and many of their students will go on to desegregate that community as well. And so they are there to bear witness not only to letting their students do what they could not do and were not allowed to do, but also to bear witness and share in that partnership and be in solidarity with these young women as they embark on desegregation in a different kind of way. It's important to remember that young women who desegregate white communities are doing something very different from their secular counterparts. For those images of young children who desegregate public schools in the 50s and 60s, remember that they get to go home at night. Young Black girls who desegregate white communities are oftentimes forced, and they are oftentimes in isolation from their own communities. They don't get to go home at night. It's 24/7. But also, they not only have to desegregate their orders, they have to desegregate the convents, the institutions of higher education, the schools or the hospitals in which their communities minister in, and also often the sundown towns and hostile neighborhoods in which those convents and schools are located. What's also very important to remember in terms of the Oblate Sisters of Providence is that they are also saving the lives of early African Americans who are victims of racial hate crimes. There are several sisters, women who become Oblate Sisters of Providence, who are the children of lynch victims. One of these women is Oblate Sister of Providence, Felix Manzilla. Her father, Professor Wayne Manzilla, was an early African-American graduate of a small college in Ohio. He later becomes the first African-American high school principal in Texas. He then goes on to become a math professor at Langston University, or college, now university, in Oklahoma. At the turn of the 20th century, he is lynched, and the individuals are never caught or prosecuted. Also, we know that after his lynching, the insurance company refuses to pay out to the family, and they are pushed into crushing poverty. A white priest ministering in Oklahoma takes pity on the family. Wayne Manzilla's wife cannot handle what happened, and so she is in fact institutionalized. Her children become paupers, and a white priest takes the children to all of the white sisterhoods in Oklahoma, and none will accept the children. However, he learns that the Oblate Sisters of Providence own and operate orphanages for Black children in Leavenworth, Kansas. And so this white priest takes them from Oklahoma into Kansas, and the children are saved by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and one of the daughters becomes Sister Felix. And in her file in the Oblate archive is the documentation of years of the family trying to sue the insurance company for never paying out this debt after the lynching of their father. They are never successful. We also know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence in St. Louis, Missouri also serve as take in the survivors of the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. Those who survive and make their way, a significant number of those survivors make their way to St. Louis and resettle in St. Louis. And in the archives and in the diaries of the sisters who are stationed at their St. Rita's Academy, they document all of the African-American families who had daughters, who brought their daughters to the Oblates. What's interesting in this diary, they note sort of the name of the undertaker. They noted that although he had survived the massacre, because he refused to bury the victims, the white victims, because Black people were able to defend themselves in certain instances, that when he arrived to them, that his ears were cut off. But the sisters took in his daughters, and he pleads with them, to ensure that his daughter, the youngest daughter, can sleep in the same bed as the older daughter because they are terrified at what had happened. The sisters take those young children in, and ironically, just a year later in 1922, they themselves will suffer a similar attack when they move their convent from an all-Black community into an all-white riverfront community in St. Louis, eventually forcing the police to come in and protect the sisters and the young girls when they move into this all-white community in St. Louis. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, again, as pioneering students at the nation's earliest Catholic colleges and universities, although historical records and history books note that the first African-American students at St. Louis University in Missouri arrived in 1944, we know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are there as early as 1927. Their first African-American graduate is actually Sister Mary Laurentia Short, who is a native of Washington, D.C. She actually writes her undergraduate thesis on James Weldon Johnson, the poet, also the author of the Negro National Anthem or the African American National Anthem. It's likely the first undergraduate thesis ever produced in Black Studies at St. Louis University. She earns her degree in 1935. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are also the first Black students at Villanova. They reintegrate the Catholic University of America, Loyola, Maryland, and so on. And again, as I mentioned, in all student newspapers, we see very clearly that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are champions of Black and Black Catholic history. And because state laws changed that require private school teachers to have at least normal certificates and later bachelor's degrees, this is a monumental challenge for all communities, but especially for the Black sisterhoods, because most Catholic institutions at that time would not accept African Americans, despite the fact that church law and code said that all Catholics must be educated in Catholic schools. So the Oblate Sisters of Providence write to the Vatican for help, and the Vatican sends in and begins to identify progressive white church officials who forced their hand, including Bishop Curley. In fact, in 1932, when he's writing to the rector at CUA, he states, quote, or he writes, quote, I'm afraid we're going very far now, yielding to prejudice when we exclude the colored sisters from the Catholic University. And the first African-American graduates in over 2 decades, and the first Black women graduates of the Catholic University of America are Oblate Sisters of Providence, Mary of Good Counsel Baptiste, and Mary Consolata Gibson, both of whom are natives of New Orleans. In the case of these two Oblate Sisters of Providence, Naomi Smith and Catherine Bentley, they are the first African-American graduates of the Graduate School of Loyola in Maryland. Also significant, when we tell Black sister stories, we also are able to recover the works of Black laywomen. At the center of this particular photo is a woman named Medea Bates or Madra Bates. She founds one of the oldest Black Catholic churches in Detroit, Michigan. She founds her own parish because no parishes will accept Black faithful in the west part of Detroit, and we know for years that she walks 5 miles to and from the only parish that would accept Black people and not violently throw them out, to the point that she founds her own parish after she has children because she cannot make that walk every day. She begs for decades until finally they are able to sort of send a priest, and then eventually they send in the Oblate Sisters of Providence. When she dies, in the Oblate Annals, you see great mourning. The sisters write, it's a terrible day. Medea Bates has died. Everyone is upset. And then they document in their annals that people came from across Detroit because they knew what this woman had done. So anytime that you see a photo with her, with the sisters, note that they always put Medea Bates at the center of the photo. They give her that place of honor. And they also say in the annals, she founded this parish. But if you ever read a history of Our Lady of Victory Parish in Detroit, you will never see her name because technically lay people cannot found a parish, even though that parish had been operating for 2 decades before the priest comes. But she's not mentioned except in the annals of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and of course in the histories written by the lay people themselves, because they knew that she had founded that parish and it had been operating long before the church said it had been operating. And this is what you're going to get when you begin to explore the history of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and Mother Mary Lange. This herself is her legacy. The Oblate Sisters of Providence, one Oblate Sister of Providence, in fact, will be the first Catholic sister to ever establish a Head Start program. That is Sister Infanta Marie Gonzalez, Marie Infanta Gonzalez. She's actually the niece of Sister Mary Consolata Gibson, who reintegrated the Catholic University of America. The Oblate Sisters of Providence also march. They, against the bishop's directions, march in the March on Washington. They also go and serve in their communities following the uprisings that followed the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We can see them marching in various demonstrations. Here, 2 Oblate Sisters of Providence are participating in the Memorial March in Mobile, Alabama, following King's assassination. The sister, if you can see her right behind this man, she's very, very short, but she's there. There's another sister to her right that they marched there. And this is the march that is seen to be a turning point in race relations in Mobile. Other Oblate Sisters of Providence, even if they leave the community, continue to break barriers. This is Sister Mary Marcelina Brooks. She will eventually leave the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but she was probably one of the most respected Catholic sisters in Washington, D.C., having served as the principal of most of the Black Catholic schools, high schools, and elementary schools in Washington, D.C. She later becomes the first woman president of Bowie State University, which is a historically Black university in Maryland. I also want to draw your attention to Sister Thea Bowman, servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman, who is the third African-American sister on the road to sainthood. In particular, most people may not know, but Sister Thea did actually earn her PhD in English from the Catholic University of America, where she actually taught the institution's first course in African-American literature. Remember that she would not have been able to do that without sort of the pioneer efforts of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, specifically Mother Mary of Good Counsel Baptiste and Consolata Gibson. And I say this also, too, because this history is a history that on the one hand has been suppressed, but is still known by lots of people who have been touched by the legacy of Mother Mary Lange and her Oblate Sisters of Providence. When I began doing my work, what struck me the most was that so many people reached out to me if they were like, make sure that you're writing about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and gave me lots of information and stories about sisters that one can only get from oral history. One woman in particular said, when she found out about my book coming, she said, "Are the Oblate Sisters of Providence included?" And I said, "Absolutely." She said, "That's wonderful. My former teacher and the most wonderful person in the world, Sister Emily Burks, was a member of that order." And those are the Burks sisters. That's one of the Burks sisters from Louisville, Kentucky. Other people reached out to me and told me great stories. You know, it was a pre-rehearsed drill on manners. If your teacher introduced a guest to your class, the teacher would say, "Class, this is Mrs. Jefferson." At attention and union, class would respond, "Good morning, Mrs. Jefferson. May God bless you." They also said, you know, the sisters, they always lived in our communities and they made house visits. And you were always afraid because they were coming in the house and they needed to make sure that you had your book studying and ready. But they loved us, and we knew that they loved us at every turn. In other instances, someone reached out to me and said, you know, in the 1990s, I had the pleasure of working with a nun from the Oblate Sisters of Oblate Order in Baltimore who was volunteering at a small group home for HIV-positive babies. This was at a time that AIDS was feared, so the good work of Mother Lange continues. And I was like, "Do you by chance know the sister's name?" And then he finally said, "I think it was Sister Marie Vianney," and it was Sister Marie Vianney Ware, who had since passed on. But what's interesting in her file, she's working so hard, and eventually the sisters are writing to the community in the home that she's working with, and they say, "Well, we're concerned because Sister is coming home really late, but she's so dedicated," and they're just letters and letters. She had served as a principal before that, but in retirement, she wanted to continue to serve, and very few people would deal with children, and so she went and remained until her health did not allow her to go anymore. We also know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence and their St. Francis Academy continues to sort of be in the news. In fact, one of their alum, Angel Reese, is a basketball champion, NCAA champion from the Louisiana State University Championship basketball team. And I want to end with this story because beyond their academics, there are pioneering Black doctors, dentists, military veterans, et cetera, who can all trace their lineage to the schools operated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Most of their schools were in the Deep South, but they also had schools in Cuba and other parts of Latin America, specifically in spaces where Afro-Caribbean children were not allowed to enter into the Catholic schools. But they also went into the North, in New York, New Jersey, in Minnesota, Chicago, Detroit, et cetera. But in particular, beyond their academics, they were also noted particularly for the strength of their athletics, in part their basketball teams. And this is an important story. So this is Judge Arthur McFarland, who's a former judge, a pioneering judge in Charleston, South Carolina, is also a former attorney for the Knights of St. Peter Claver. He was among the students selected at Immaculate Conception, the Oblate School, the first Black Catholic high school in the state of South Carolina, operated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, to integrate into Bishop England. He was selected not only for his high intelligence, but also because of his athletic ability. He talks in particular about his ability to sort of do so well as an honor student there because he had learned Latin and French from the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and credited the Oblate Sisters of Providence also with his conversion to Catholicism. He was and his family were members of the AME Church, but their parents had all put their children into the Catholic school run by these distinguished educating nuns. And he talks about, how his mother sent them to Immaculate Conception and what they had done in Immaculate Conception and how well prepared they were to integrate into the school. And also the schools use basketball as a way to sports, in particular basketball, to facilitate that integration. Now, what's important about all of the basketball teams operated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they had state championship boys and girls basketball teams wherever they were. They were all coached by Sister Mary Paul Lee. Sister Mary Paul Lee was educated and born in Philadelphia. She and her sister were educated by the Religious Sisters of Mercy, but rejected admission into that community on the basis of race, so they became Oblate Sisters of Providence. Their father, John Aloysius Lee Sr., was the second African-American graduate of Philadelphia's Roman Catholic High School, which is the oldest Catholic high school in the nation. He is also the first African-American to ever play on a Catholic basketball league. He integrates that at the turn of the 20th century and becomes a basketball champion. Then he graduates from high school, begins a career as a distinguished postal worker, but also a distinguished layman. He wins the first African-American to win the Vercelli Medal from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. But also what he does is, in Philadelphia, he begins to found all these Black men and women basketball leagues, swimming leagues, golf leagues, et cetera, because they are excluded from public sports leagues. To the point that he has actually a recreation center named after him in West Philadelphia, the Lee Recreation Center. His father, William Henry Lee, was one of the slaves and owned by the Jesuits and enslaved at Georgetown. Now, his granddaughter, their niece, Sister Cora Marie, will finally desegregate the Religious Sisters of Mercy in Philadelphia just a decade later. Sister Cora Marie is still alive. Now, when people started reaching out to me when they found out that I was writing this book, they would say, how blessed I was coming from the AME Baptist background. And they would say, we were state basketball championship leagues. And, they would all say, Sister Mary Paul Lee was the best basketball player that we ever saw. In fact, this man says, the first person I ever saw do a crossover dribble was Sister Paul. Now, this is Sister Paul's father. This is John Aloysius Lee. This is the basketball team that he was a member of. Now, the story goes is that when they go to the championship league, the opposing team refused to play because they had a Black person on the team. His white teammates said, if Johnny Lee doesn't play, we don't play. And so they played and they won. Now, Mary Paul in her obituary says when that happened to her in the 40s in Philadelphia, she was not allowed to go to the away teams, and her team went with her and they broke her heart. However, she did not let that heartbreak stop her from training that next generation who are going to integrate the schools. That is the beauty and the story of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the legacies and the stories that their members carry. This is a photograph of the Lee Recreation Center in West Philadelphia, named after John Aloysius Lee Sr. and his daughter. She is able to carry that tradition forward. That is the legacy of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and Mother Mary Lange. People who fought to make their church truly Catholic, to be what it says, people who understood that racism had no place within the church. The last thing that I want to say about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, beyond the legacy of their members, it's also important to note that the Oblate Sisters of Providence give rise to 3 additional communities in the United States. One of them are the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM Sisters, founded by Sister Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who is actually a founding member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but who leaves in 1848 to found a white community and passes for white for the rest of her life. She herself will be subjected to historical erasure, with her community trying to erase her from their heritage, but they have reclaimed her. I also want to mention the 3rd African-American surviving sisterhood, the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary, founded in Savannah. Their foundress, Mother Theodore, was actually a former member of the Oblate Sister of Providence. It's why the habit of the handmaids is so similar to the Oblate habit. It's the same habit. She didn't give it back when she left. And I also want to briefly mention Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster, who has come to us because of her potentially uncorruptible remains in Missouri. She is a longtime member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but leaves the community to found an interracial Benedictine community in 1995. So the Oblates not only have their own history, but they also can be connected to the other legacies of notable communities within the United States. And indeed, when I say why the story of Venerable Mother Mary Lange matters, It is because simply she is not a woman who was desiring to be a saint. She was simply someone seeking to do God's work and someone who understood that the lives, souls, and futures of Black people mattered. This indeed is the story of America's real Sister Act, and it is a story that I think every American Catholic should know. Thank you. If I've gone over, I don't know if there's any time for questions.
We do have a few minutes. We've
Sure.
got 7 or 8 minutes for questions still. So thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that beautiful reminder of how much history matters, but also how much it matters whose histories and which stories we pay attention to when we narrate the story of Catholicism in particular. We have, as I said, a few minutes for questions, so I want to open it up to those who may have questions for Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Williams. I just was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how the Oblate Sisters of Providence kind of take in, I guess, a known enslaved individual. And you allude that we know stuff, and I was just curious if you could mention a little bit more.
Right. So in the case of the enslaved woman who eventually becomes a member of the Oblate Sister of Providence, so she is actually owned by a white granddaughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who is living in Baltimore. And this woman has put this young girl, we don't know, no, we don't know who she is, but we know that she is paying for her education at St. Francis Academy. And we know that this woman sought admission into the community after graduating from St. Francis Academy. And so it's not clear if she's necessarily running away, but we do know that there is no pushback from her enslaver once she decides to go into religious life, and to the point that she's able to gain her freedom. We also know in certain instances, right, so what we gain great insights into the rosters of their school, right? They are educating enslaved children. Many of the enslaved children that they are educating are the children of planters and enslaved women that they own, not only from Maryland, but also from Latin America and the Caribbean. So sometimes these men who have children, in the same way that, the free people of color who will also play a significant role in the Haitian Revolution are being educated in France, right? Some of these planters send their children to the St. Francis Academy. They also send them to St. Mary's Academy, run by the Sisters of the Holy Family. They send the girls to the schools run. And so oftentimes, although they are enslaved, they have ties to very, very wealthy and affluent planters that are coming out of the slave system. And so in some instances, obviously not all, some of these men do acknowledge paternity of these children and seek to their education. And that's where we have a good portion of those enslaved children who are being educated by the sisters, and in some cases, those who go on into the community as well. And so it's just simply their connections to affluence that also creates a different and a more elaborate paper record where we can trace these young women, excuse me.
Other questions from the audience?
Thank you, Dr. Williams, very much. I'm just very curious. I know you mentioned the Bishop of Baltimore had to have some type of hand in making sure that Sister Mary Lange, Lange, could actually form the order. Excuse me. And but I'm just very curious, like, what was the relationship between Sister Mary Lange and the various bishops? Was it tense? Was there a lot of interference? Did they leave her alone?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. So the bishop who approves the formation of the community is doing so really reluctantly, I should say. There is profound resistance, and we see that very clearly documented in the diary of Father James Jobert. And then the next bishop is going to be extremely hostile to the community. In fact, following the death of Father James Jobert, that bishop denies any priest ministering in the Archdiocese of Baltimore permission to go offer Mass at the convent. So he's trying to strangle the community out. This is why the IHM sisters are formed, right? So Teresa Maxis Duchemin and another sister, Anne Schaaf, who are racially ambiguous, they find a Belgian priest. First, Teresa Maxis Duchemin tries to go into a Belgian community, but they will not accept her. Then there is a priest that's going into Michigan because they want to found the first Catholic school for children in Michigan, and so they're founding a community. But it's clear they can only found a white community, and so that's why they go, because it's in a moment of chaos. And literally what we know from the written record from the Oblates is that the bishop in 1845 tells them that they should just simply go be maids. What happens is that another Belgian priest intervenes and prostrates himself before the bishop and begs for the survival of the community. So they have a very contentious, and I shouldn't say contentious, they don't have a contentious relationship with the bishop, but there is great opposition to the organization of communities for African-descended women and girls in cities and in archdioceses grounded in slavery, right? It's important to sort of think about. Baltimore and Maryland contain two of the largest slave markets in the nation. So what does it mean for these women to not only sort of embrace the religious state in the institution, the Catholic Church, which is most responsible for the rise of African slavery in the Americas, most responsible, obviously, for articulating the doctrine of discovery, for these women to say, no one has a right to my body, to cover themselves and says the only person that has a right to my body is God. Because they use all sorts of racist and sexual stereotypes about Black women and men to try to keep them out of religious life. That is the foundations of white Christian supremacy that is articulated and upheld with these anti-Black admissions policies. And so what does it mean for these women? Because they're striking at the core of this tenet of white Christian supremacy that all Black people are immoral. Right? And sexually promiscuous. So they are pushing back at this. When they are embracing the religious state, they are engaging in an act of radical liberation. And so what does it mean when they are living in spaces where slave markets, where Black women's and girls' naked bodies are put on display on the auction block? And so this matters, especially with the Oblate Sisters of Providence and also with the Sisters of the Holy Family. The Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans are also even more explicit, right? They begin to buy up properties associated with the sins of slavery and also the sexual abuse of women of their class and color. Those women are products of that system that was known as plissage, where these European French men, because all of their fathers, right, are German, French, et cetera, and their mothers were these free women of color that these men took as these concubines, but they passed on property to them. And these women see this as a form of sexual slavery. And so they say, no, we're going into religious life. And then after the federal abolition of slavery, they begin to buy up properties. The first school is a former slave trader's pen. They also buy up the former Quadroon Ballroom, which becomes their mother house and the headquarters of St. Mary's Academy. And they say in their history, first history, they said it was a den of sin because that's where the women in their community would have been forced to go to make these liaisons with these men. And they say, no, we will redeem these spaces. We will turn it into our schools. And so they also have a very contentious relationship. In the case of the Holy Family Sisters, unlike the Oblates, the Holy Family Sisters are not allowed to wear veils for the first 50 years of their existence. And so they have to fight to be able to even wear the habit. And it also helps us to understand then why the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the other African American sisterhoods have never abandoned the veil. It's because they said, we had to fight so long to have it, we will never give it up. And so that's why you can distinguish, you can tell generally if an African-American woman is a member of a white community or a Black community. The Black communities never abandoned the habit because of that history of being denied the habit for so long, which is very much rooted also in their canonization causes, that their causes are not launched until the 1990s. After that visit from Pope John Paul II, right? And he meets with the African-American Catholic community. He says, if you want to get it done, you need to get it done now, because there will be support for these causes that would not have existed beforehand. So there's obviously a contentious relationship, and I think it's going to remain until I think the church tells the truth about itself, right? Because these women also embody this fundamental truth. You can't tell their story without confronting the church's mostly unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. So thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Williams once again.
Thank you.